Okay, today we are starting to take notes in section 2.2 in your book, and the title of this statement, or the title of this section, is called Conditional Statements. And a conditional statement is one with conditions. For example, I'm sure you've heard the words, if you do your chores, then you will get an allowance. Or maybe you've heard, if you study for your test, then you will make a good grade. So a conditional statement is an if-then statement. And a lot of times in geometry, we will call it if P, then Q. So if P happens, then Q happens. And in a conditional statement, you always have a hypothesis and a conclusion. The hypothesis is the part following if. And the conclusion is the part following then. In other words, it does not include if, the hypothesis does not, and the conclusion does not include then, but it's the part following that. And so in your P, if P, then Q, then P is the hypothesis and Q is the conclusion. The converse of a conditional statement switches the hypothesis and conclusion. In other words, whenever I say, if you do your chores, then you will get an allowance, that's the conditional statement. The converse of that statement says, if you get an allowance, then you will do your chores. Or in the statement where I say, if you study for your test, then you will make a good grade, the converse is, if you make a good grade, then you study for your test. Note that the converse is not necessarily a true statement, but it does switch the hypothesis and the conclusion. So in numbers 1 through 4, your directions just say to underline the hypothesis and circle the conclusion of each conditional. Okay, and so I'm going to do number 1, and then you're going to hit pause, try numbers 2, 3, and 4, and then check your answers. Number 1, the hypothesis. If a number is divisible by 2, then the number is even. The hypothesis is the if part. So we're going to underline a number is divisible by 2. And the conclusion is the then part. Then the number is even. Now hit pause and you try 2, 3, and 4. For number 2, the hypothesis is the sidewalks are wet. The conclusion is it has been raining. For number 3, it's a little bit in a different order. The dog will bark if a stranger walks by the house. The hypothesis is actually a stranger walks by the house and the dog will bark is the conclusion. In number 4, the hypothesis is a triangle has 3 congruent angles. The conclusion is the triangle is equilateral. Numbers 5 through 8 tell you to write each sentence as a conditional. In other words, you are going to write it as an if-then statement. And so I'll do number 5, and again you'll pause and try numbers 6, 7, and 8. Number 5 says, if a regular pentagon has exactly 5 congruent sides. So we're going to change this to an if-then statement. And our hypothesis is if a polygon is a regular pentagon, I should say, then it has exactly 5 congruent sides. if a polygon is a regular pentagon, then it has exactly 5 congruent sides. You may not have gotten the polygon part right, but we'll work on that as we get farther in geometry. We'll understand the vocabulary a little better. Now hit pause and you try 6, 7, and 8. Number 6. The conditional statement is if a substance is uranium, then it is radioactive. Number 7, if two angles are complementary, then they form a right angle. And number 8, if a fish is a catfish, then it has no scales. And we have a problem. We like to use the word it a whole lot. And so we need to be careful. Instead of saying if it is a catfish, then it has no scales, try to put the category. If a fish is a catfish, then it has no scales. In numbers 9 and 10, your directions tell you to write a conditional statement that each Venn diagram illustrates. And so you have to understand what a Venn diagram does, and I think probably all of you do, but pretty much this Italian fits inside of Romance languages. So everything Italian is also a Romance language, and we have to write that as a conditional statement. So the way we would write that is if a person speaks Italian, then he or she speaks a Romance language. All right, what I want you to do is you push pause and you try to do number 10 by yourself and then check your answer. Number 10, if a quadrilateral is a square, then it is a rhombus because all squares are considered rhombuses. And you may not have used the word quadrilateral. Again, we're going to get to naming shapes correctly. You may have used if a shape is a square, but right now that's okay. But later on, we'll be able to call a quadrilateral and understand what it means. Numbers 11 and 12, it says determine if the conditional is true or false, and then if it's false, provide a counterexample. And remember that a counterexample is an example that proves your statement false, it proves it wrong. And so looking at number 11, it says if the figure has four congruent angles, then the figure is a square. And so you read that, you determine if it's true or false. And this is actually a false statement. If it has four congruent angles, then it is a square. There is something else that it could be also. And the counterexample would be rectangle. A rectangle also has four congruent angles, four 90-degree angles. You try number 12 and see if you can provide the counterexample. If it's false, if it's true, you just write true and move on to the next one. Number 12, if an animal barks, then it is a seal. That is false. Something else barks, and that would be a dog. Numbers 13 through 15 says to write the converse of the conditional statement. Remember, the converse just switches the hypothesis and the conclusion. And so when we go to write the converse of number 13, we're going to keep the if and the then, and then we're going to switch the hypothesis and conclusion. So for number 13, it reads, if two angles are complementary, then their measures sum to 90. And so we need to switch the if and then part and say if two angles, or if two angle measures sum to 90, then they are complementary. Okay, I want you to hit pause and you try numbers 14 and 15. Okay, so for numbers 14 and 15, 14, your converse of the conditional statement should read, if ice forms on the sidewalks, then the temperature outside is freezing. Number 15, I put a star beside it, and I'll tell you why in a second. If a figure has exactly 4 sides, then it is a rectangle. And the reason that I put a star beside that is because I told you earlier that a converse does not necessarily have to be true. And so this one for sure is not true. If a figure has exactly 4 sides, then it is a rectangle. It could be a square, a rhombus, a kite, any quadrilateral. And so again, the star is because it does not necessarily have to be true. Now, what I want you to do, we have to draw a Venn diagram. I missed number 16 and 17. They want us to draw a Venn diagram to illustrate each statement. If a figure is a square, then it's a rectangle. So we're going to start with square. It says if it is a square, then it should be a rectangle. So your square circle should be inside your rectangle circle. And this is if it is a square, then it is a rectangle. Okay, you hit pause and you try number 17 by yourself. In number 17, you should have rugby as the small circle inside of team sport. If the game is rugby, then it is a team sport. Now what I want you to do is get your practice assignment, and you are going to move your desk and work on your own. Be ready for a short little quiz at the end of class. It may just be just a target check to make sure you understood what you were supposed to understand. If you have any questions on the practice assignment, let me know. I'll have the answers at the podium, so if you want to check your answers, you may check them at the podium. And then if for some reason you get finished way early, then you can begin listening to the next assignment.